By the time they realized what I was about to do, it was already too late. I was standing at the front of St. Agatha's funeral home, beside an open mahogany casket, dressed in black from my collar to my heels. The room behind me held perhaps 50 people, neighbors, colleagues, relatives who had driven in from other cities, friends who had wept on the phone when I called them with the news. The air was thick with white lilies and low conversation, with the particular hush that settles over a room full of people who are all, collectively, trying to hold themselves together. The casket was polished and still. Inside it lay my husband, Raymond Osei, 37 years old, financial consultant, the man I had shared a home, a bed, and a life with for 9 years. He was dressed in a dark suit I had never seen before. His hands were folded. His face was composed in the careful stillness of a man at permanent rest. Except he wasn't at rest. He was holding his breath. I knew that. I had known it since the previous night. And as I stood there accepting the quiet touches on my arm, the whispered condolences, the sorrowful eyes of people who believed they were mourning with me, I was doing something else entirely. I was waiting. There was a bucket on the floor beside the casket. White plastic, unremarkable. It held an arrangement of white calla lilies, stems submerged in cold water. Ice water specifically, because I had added ice that morning before the mourners arrived, while the room was still empty and the funeral home staff were setting up chairs in the back. Nobody questioned the bucket. A grieving widow bringing fresh flowers to her husband's casket is not a detail that draws attention. It is, in fact, exactly the kind of detail people find quietly moving. I had counted on that. I stood there for 1 hour and 40 minutes. I listened to a eulogy delivered by Raymond's colleague, a man named Patrick, who spoke about Raymond's dedication and warmth, and the way he always remembered everyone's birthday. I listened to Ruth, Raymond's mother, speak about the boy he had been: curious, disciplined, fiercely loving. She wept through most of it. The room wept with her. I did not weep. When it was my turn to speak, I walked to the front slowly, the way a grieving woman walks. I turned to face the room. And then, instead of the address I had been expected to deliver, the one I had written and shared with the funeral director the previous week, the one about love and loss and the inexplicability of what the sea takes, I said something different. I said, "Before I speak about my husband, I'd like to show you something." I turned to the casket. I reached down. I lifted the bucket. And I poured it directly onto Raymond's face. The gasp that came out of him was not the sound of a dead man. It was immediate, involuntary, and total, the full-body response of a living person hit with ice water without warning. He sat up. In the casket. At his own funeral. In front of 50 people who had driven from across the city to mourn him. For approximately 3 seconds, the room produced no sound at all. Then it produced every sound at once. Hello, friends. Welcome, or welcome back if you've been here before. If you are new to this channel, please take a moment right now to subscribe. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss what comes next. If this story moves you, or disturbs you, which it might, give it a like and share it with someone you think should hear it. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I read every single one and I genuinely want to know. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. Because what happened at that funeral did not begin at that funeral. It began much earlier, in the small, quiet, almost invisible ways that the most consequential things usually do. I am an architect. I have been one for 11 years, and before that I spent 5 years studying to become one, and before that I was a child who took apart her toys not to break them but to understand how they were held together. I say this not to establish credentials but to establish character, because the way a person thinks about their work is usually the way they think about everything. I am trained to look at structures, to identify load-bearing elements, to notice, with reasonable precision, when something that appears stable is supported by less than it should be. I was 34 years old when this story begins. Raymond and I had been married for 7 years at that point, together for 9. We had met at a mutual friend's dinner party when I was 25 and he was 28. And what drew me to him initially was the quality of his attention. He listened the way few people listen, fully, without the slight distraction that most people carry into conversations, that low hum of self-consciousness that makes you feel you're talking to someone who is also simultaneously thinking about how they're coming across. Raymond was not like that. When he looked at you, you felt seen. Later, I would come to understand that quality differently. A man who is exceptionally good at making people feel seen has usually spent a great deal of time practicing. Our marriage was not a passionate one in the conventional sense. What it was and what I valued about it was functional, stable, mutually understood. We had shared goals, a home we were paying down, a plan to travel more once the heavier work years eased, a quiet agreement about the kind of life we were building. Raymond managed our finances, which suited us both. He was the expert. I was often absorbed in projects. The division made sense and I never questioned it because I had no reason to. That is the part one have spent the most time thinking about in the years since. Not the betrayal itself, but the conditions I maintained that allowed it to grow undisturbed. The first indication that something was wrong arrived on a Tuesday evening in early October, approximately 14 months before the funeral. I had been trying to access our joint savings account through the bank's online portal. I needed to confirm the balance before scheduling a payment to a contractor on a project I was managing. The portal loaded. I entered the credentials we had set up together. The page returned an error. Account not accessible. Please contact customer service or visit your nearest branch. I noted it. I assumed it was a technical issue. Banks run maintenance, lock accounts for security updates, send notifications that go to spam. I made a mental note to follow up and moved on. 2 days later, the same error. That evening, I mentioned it to Raymond at dinner. Casually, the way you mention a dripping tap. He looked up from his food. His expression was attentive. Not confused, not startled. Attentive. The way a person looks when they have been waiting for a specific question and have already prepared the answer. I'll call them tomorrow, he said. It's probably the new security verification system they're rolling out. He said it smoothly, completely, without the slight pause that comes from actually trying to retrieve a memory. I noted that too and set it aside. He did not call them the next day, or the day after. When I asked again at the end of the week, he said he had called, that the issue was a back-end update, that it would be resolved within 10 days. 10 days passed. Nothing changed. Separately, and without any conscious decision to do so, I began to watch him more carefully. Raymond had always been a phone-on-the-table person. Not performatively, just habitually. His phone lived on flat surfaces near him, face up, unremarkable. Around the time of the account error it moved. First to his pocket, then to a face-down position when he did set it down. Then to the next room entirely whenever he took certain calls. I would hear him sometimes from the kitchen speaking in the garden. His voice carried but his words didn't. The tone was low, unhurried. Nothing about it sounded urgent or distressed. It sounded, if anything, like a man engaged in comfortable conversation. He began traveling more. Before that period, his work trips were predictable. Quarterly visits to clients, announced in advance, itineraries shared over dinner. These new trips were different. Shorter, vaguer. A meeting, he'd say. A client situation I need to handle in person. He would be gone for a night, sometimes two, and return neither particularly tired nor particularly forthcoming. He would resume his normal behavior with a seamlessness that, in retrospect, was itself the tell. Real trips leave small residues, tiredness, anecdotes, the minor friction of re-entry. These trips left nothing. His answers to my questions were always sufficient. That was what made them difficult to challenge. Not too long, not too brief. Detailed enough to seem candid, vague enough to be unverifiable. When I asked which client he'd visited, He named a company I recognized from previous conversations. When I asked how the meeting had gone, he gave me 2 sentences that were entirely plausible. The problem was not that his answers were wrong. The problem was the texture of them, smooth in a way that real memory isn't. Real memory has small imperfections, small hesitations, moments where you reach for the word. Raymond's answers had none of that. I told myself for several weeks that I was being paranoid, that the account issue was a banking error, that his phone habits were simply changing, that the trips were what he said they were. I told myself this with genuine effort, because I did not want to be a woman building suspicion from nothing, and because the alternative, that my husband was actively deceiving me, was a conclusion I was not prepared to reach without evidence. I need evidence, I told myself. Not a feeling. Evidence. I went to the bank in person on a Thursday morning before work. I brought my identification, my marriage certificate, and my co-signatory documentation. I sat across from a branch manager named Mr. Adeyemi, who was professional and unhurried, and I asked him plainly to explain the status of our joint account. He looked at his screen. He looked at me. He asked me to give him a moment. What he told me, in the measured tone of a man delivering information he has delivered in various forms many times before, was this. The account was not frozen, and it was not under maintenance. The account was empty. It had been emptied through a series of transfers over the preceding 11 months, systematic, incremental, routed through 2 intermediary accounts, neither of which I recognized. The most recent transfer had occurred 9 days prior. He gave me the total that had been moved. I looked at the number on the paper he slid across the desk. I looked at it for what felt like a long time but was probably 4 or 5 seconds. Then I thanked him. I asked for a printed statement of all transactions from the preceding 18 months. He provided it. I folded it, put it in my bag, stood up, shook his hand, and walked to my car. I sat in the parking lot for a while. I did not cry. I was not, in that moment, particularly emotional in the way people expect emotion to arrive, not shaking, not stunned. What I felt was something closer to recognition. The specific, cold, clarifying feeling of a structure revealing itself. Of seeing finally what had been holding everything up, and understanding that it was not what I had believed. I drove to my office. I had a 9 o'clock meeting. I attended it. That evening, I made a call I had been, without fully acknowledging it, preparing to make for several weeks. I called a private investigator named Gerald Blake, referred to me by a colleague who had used him in a corporate matter and described him as discreet, precise, and not given to dramatizing what he found. I met Gerald 2 days later at a coffee shop near my office. I brought the bank statement, a timeline I had constructed of Raymond's trips, the dates of the phone behavior I had observed, and the names of the 2 intermediary accounts from the transfer record. I laid it on the table between us without preamble. Gerald looked at it. He asked 3 questions. How long had I suspected something? Was I prepared for what investigation might uncover? And what specifically did I want to know? I told him I didn't need to confirm a suspicion. I needed to understand the full shape of what was happening. I told him I wanted surveillance and financial investigation both, and that I wanted everything documented in a form that could withstand legal scrutiny. He told me he would begin the following Monday. I also, separately, contacted a lawyer named Patricia Mensah, who specialized in financial fraud within marital structures. I did not tell Raymond about either contact. I told no one. I went home that evening and made dinner and sat across the table from my husband and asked him about his day. And he told me about a client meeting that had gone well, and I listened and I nodded and I passed him the salt. That was the evening I understood what it means to fully separate your external presentation from your internal state. To keep your face doing one thing while your mind does something entirely different. It is not a natural skill, but it is one that, under the right circumstances, you find you are capable of. Gerald's first report arrived 10 days later. It confirmed what the bank statement had suggested and added dimensions I had not anticipated. Raymond had been making regular visits to a private marina on the eastern edge of the city, on average twice a week, on the days he claimed to be in client meetings. He was not alone at the marina. He was accompanied, consistently, by a woman Gerald identified as Christine Adiwale, 36 years old, employed in insurance administration, resident of a coastal suburb 40 minutes from the city center. They had been observed on 7 occasions over the 10-day surveillance window. Their behavior at the marina was practical, not romantic. They were looking at vessels, speaking to marina staff, reviewing documents. Gerald described it as 2 people in the process of making logistical arrangements. That detail, logistical, stayed with me. Gerald's second report arrived 5 days after the first. This one he delivered in person at his office, which told me before he opened his mouth that what he had found was significant. On his desk was a printed document. A life insurance policy. Raymond Osei insured. Face value. $7 million. Taken out 16 months prior, just before the account irregularities had begun. I was listed as the primary beneficiary, but the document had been amended 8 months after it was initially issued to include a clause, in the event of my legal separation from Raymond at the time of his death, or in the event of my predeceasing him, the benefit would transfer entirely to a secondary named beneficiary. The secondary beneficiary was Christine Adiwale. I read the document twice. Gerald waited. I set it down. What else? He pressed play on a recording. The audio was not perfect. There was background noise, the faint lapping of water, the occasional creak of a vessel. But the voices were clear enough. Raymond's voice, low and unhurried, and Christine's, discussing a plan in the practical, detail-oriented way that 2 people discuss logistics they have been working on for some time. They talked about a body, about an identification process that Christine's professional contacts could facilitate, about timing, about the search that would follow, and how long searches of that kind typically ran before conclusions were reached. Raymond said at one point, "By the time anyone thinks to look deeper, we'll be well past the point where it matters." Gerald stopped the recording. I looked at him for a moment. Then I looked at the wall behind him. Then I looked back at him. "How long do you need to complete the documentation?" I asked. 2 weeks, he said. "Maybe 3. "Take the 3, I said. "I want everything." Now I want to pause here for just a moment. If you are still with me at this point in the story, and I think many of you are, I want to ask you to do something. Drop a comment right now with the words, "I'm still here." I want to know how many of you are truly following this, because what comes next is where this story becomes something I still find difficult to fully explain, even to myself. And I want to know you're in it with me. I went home. I made dinner. Raymond came in at 7 and sat at the kitchen table and talked about his day. I listened. I responded. I laughed once at something small he said, and it was not a performance, it came naturally, because the human capacity for normalcy is more resilient than people credit it with being. I did not cry that night. I did not cry for several weeks. Not because I wasn't affected, I was profoundly, in ways I am still accounting for, but because grief and strategy do not share space easily, and I had made a choice about which one to give the room to. I chose strategy. Grief could wait. It would get its turn. I met with Patricia Mensah and told her everything. She listened without expression, which I appreciated. She advised me on several things. What constituted legally admissible evidence in my jurisdiction? What actions would contaminate a future case and must be avoided? And when the correct moment to involve law enforcement would be. Her primary instruction was clear. Do not confront him. Do not signal awareness. Let the plan proceed far enough to become unambiguous, and then act from a position of complete documentation rather than accusation. I followed her advice with precision. I secured what remained of my personal finances. I moved my individual savings to an institution Raymond had no connection to. I installed 2 small cameras in the shared areas of our home, living room and kitchen, which was legal within our jurisdiction on shared property, and which I did without announcement. I documented everything: dates, times, behavioral observations, the content of conversations where Raymond provided explanations I could later contrast with the evidence. I kept all of it on a device Raymond had no knowledge of, backed up to a server he had no access to. At home I was a wife. I was present, warm in the ways I had always been warm, unremarkable in my behavior. I asked about his work. I planned a weekend trip we both knew privately would never happen. I maintained every surface of our shared life with the same quiet competence that had always characterized how I managed things. And underneath all of it I waited. In early February, Raymond told me he was planning a solo sailing trip. He went on these occasionally, he said. A habit from before we were married that he'd let lapse and was thinking of returning to. He had chartered a small vessel from the marina. He would be out for the weekend back Sunday evening. I told him it sounded like a good idea. I told him the water would be cold but the solitude would probably do him good. I packed him a bag of snacks the morning he left, the way a wife does. I stood at the door and watched him pull out of the driveway. Then I called Gerald. The plan, as Gerald and I had pieced it together from the recordings and the subsequent surveillance, was structured around 3 elements. First, Raymond would take the boat out, anchor it some distance offshore, and then, with Christine's coordination, create the impression of an accident. The boat adrift. No body. The search that follows. Second, through Christine's contacts in insurance administration, a body would be sourced. An unidentified John Doe, a man of roughly Raymond's build and age who had died at sea or near it, whose remains had not been claimed and whose identification records could be manipulated through a corrupt official Christine had cultivated through her professional network. The body would be processed and identified as Raymond through falsified documentation. Third, a funeral would be held. Raymond, very much alive, would lie in the casket, composed still, relying on the shock and grief of the room to prevent the kind of close, skeptical examination that might otherwise occur. After the burial, or during the chaos of the burial process, he would disappear entirely. New identity. New country. Christine would file the insurance claim as secondary beneficiary, and within a year the $7 million would be available to them both, split wherever their arrangement specified. It was, as plans go, coherent. It accounted for most variables. It had clearly been developed over a long period with genuine attention to detail. What it had not accounted for was me. The boat was reported adrift on a Monday morning. The Coast Guard launched a search. I received a call from a Coast Guard liaison at 9:47 a.m., and I sat down on the kitchen floor when I took it, not because I needed to, but because it seemed like what a wife who had just received that call would do, and I was uncertain whether Gerald had been able to confirm that the cameras Raymond had likely installed to observe my reactions were still active or had been removed. I was not going to take chances. The search ran for 11 days. It was thorough and received modest news coverage. A local businessman, presumed drowned, the kind of story that generates brief sympathy and then recedes. People called. Raymond's mother, Ruth, came immediately and stayed for 2 weeks. She was a quiet, watchful woman who had always maintained a certain formal distance with me. But in the face of what she believed was her son's death, that distance dissolved. She cooked. She prayed. She held my hand during the Coast Guard updates in a way that was genuine, and that cost me something to receive under false pretenses. On the 12th day they found a body. It was recovered 8 nautical miles from where the boat had been found, in a condition consistent with several days in open water. The identification process, conducted through the relevant authorities, confirmed it as Raymond Osei. Dental records. The documentation was clean and professionally executed. Christine's contact had done thorough work. I received the news in the living room with Ruth beside me. A Coast Guard official and a police liaison sat across from us. I did not look at the floor. I looked at the official directly, and I thanked him for telling me in person, and then I excused myself and went to the bathroom and ran the cold tap and stood over the sink for about 90 seconds. Gerald called me that evening. He had confirmation that the body was not Raymond. He had, through his own investigative contacts, already identified discrepancies in the dental record documentation, small technical, the kind of thing you would only find if you were specifically looking for them. He had photographs of Raymond alive, entering a rented property 2 hours north of the city, taken 36 hours after the body's recovery. Raymond was watching from a distance, waiting for the funeral, waiting to complete the final act. When does he need to be in the casket? I asked. Gerald was quiet for a moment. The night before at the latest. He'll need to be inside before the home is locked and alarmed for the night. My reading is he accesses it between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. Can you be there? I'll be there, he said. The funeral was arranged for the following Saturday. I handled the arrangements myself, the funeral home, the flowers, the program, the catering for the reception afterward. I was thorough and composed, and the funeral home staff treated me with the careful deference they extend to people who are managing grief through practicality. I selected white calla lilies for the casket display. I arranged them in a white plastic bucket, stems and water. I told the funeral home I would bring fresh ones the morning of the service and swap them out myself. A personal touch, I explained, something I needed to do. They accommodated me without question. I added ice to the bucket that morning before anyone arrived, in the small back room where the floral arrangements were staged. A staff member watched me do it and said nothing. There is nothing remarkable about cold water in a flower bucket on a February morning. Gerald called me at 11:47 the previous night to confirm. Raymond had entered the funeral home through a side entrance with Christine's help at approximately 11:15 p.m. A funeral home employee, later investigated and found to have received a significant payment, had facilitated the access. Raymond was in the casket by midnight. The employee had exited. Christine had left the premises at 12:20 a.m. Gerald had photographs of all of it. I thanked him. I set my alarm. I went to bed and slept for 6 hours, which I mention not to suggest I was unaffected but because I believe in being accurate. The morning of the funeral, I arrived at St. Agatha's at 8:15. The service was scheduled for 10. The staff were still setting up chairs. The room smelled of lilies and polished wood. I walked to the casket. I stood beside it for a moment and looked at the man inside. He was dressed well. His hands were folded with precision. His face was composed into an expression that was almost, but not quite, the complete absence of expression that the dead actually wear. There was a quality to it that was slightly too arranged, too deliberate, the face of someone who has practiced looking like they are not doing anything. I watched his chest for about 15 seconds. There. Just once. Just barely. A slight, involuntary rise. I reached down. I placed the bucket of calla lilies, ice water and all, on the floor directly beside the head of the casket, close enough that I would not need to reach far. Then I went to greet the arriving mourners. For 1 hour and 40 minutes I was a widow. I received people at the door. I accepted embraces and condolences and the particular helpless kindness that people extend when they do not know what else to offer. Patrick, Raymond's colleague, pressed my hand for a long time and said Raymond had been the best person he knew. Ruth arrived with 2 of her sisters, and the sight of the casket produced from her a sound I will not try to describe and have never forgotten. I guided people to their seats. I accepted a program from the funeral director. I sat in the front row with Ruth to my left, and I listened to Patrick's eulogy, which was generous and sincere and described a man I recognized from the early years of our marriage, warm, attentive, dependable. The man he was describing had existed. That was the part that required the most discipline to sit with. Not the fraud, not the plan, but the fact that the qualities people were eulogizing had been real at some point, and had been redirected into something else without my knowledge. Ruth spoke. Her voice broke several times and recovered. She talked about Raymond's childhood, about the value she had tried to give him, about her belief that he was at peace. She looked at me once while she spoke, and the expression on her face was one I did not deserve and could not refuse. When the eulogies ended, the funeral director turned to me. My address was next. I stood. I walked to the front. I turned to face the room. I looked at the people in those chairs, 52 faces by my count, most of them oriented toward me with the open, ready attention of people expecting to be moved. I looked at Gerald near the back, standing against the wall with his hands folded. I looked at the two plainclothes officers near the side exit, positioned as we had arranged in the conversation I had with Patricia and the financial crimes detective 5 days prior. I looked last at the casket. I said, "Before I speak about my husband, I'd like to show you something about him. Something I think everyone in this room deserves to understand." There was a small shift in the room. Not alarm. Just attention sharpening. I spoke for 4 minutes. I spoke about the joint account and the 11 months of systematic transfers. I spoke about a life insurance policy worth $7 million and the name of the secondary beneficiary. I spoke about a body that was not my husband's body, and the official whose documentation had been purchased, and the corrupt process by which a stranger's remains had been identified as Raymond Osei. I spoke about a recording in which my husband's voice discussed, in clear and practical terms, how to disappear from a life he had decided to leave, while ensuring that the financial architecture of that life came with him. I spoke without notes. I spoke without raising my voice. The room, which had begun with the ambient sounds of a grieving gathering, the small coughs, the shifting in seats, the muted weeping, went progressively, completely silent. I turned to the casket. I reached down and lifted the bucket. I tipped it forward over Raymond's face. The water, cold, fully iced, poured from a height of perhaps 2 feet, hit him across the forehead and nose and ran down his collar. His response was not a decision. It was biology. The gasp came from somewhere below consciousness, immediate and total. A full-body reflex that bypassed every preparation he had made for this moment. His hands, which had been so carefully folded, flew apart. His eyes opened. He sat up in the casket and turned toward me with an expression I will spend the rest of my life trying to find the precise language for. It was not guilt. It was not fear. It was the specific expression of a person who has built a very complex structure and watched it come apart in a single moment, and who cannot yet determine how much of it is salvageable. The answer, though he didn't know it yet, was none of it. The room produced no sound for approximately 3 seconds. Then it produced everything. I set the bucket on the display table beside the casket. I looked at Raymond. I said, in a voice that was quieter than everything else in the room and therefore, I think, the thing everyone heard most clearly, "You should have stayed at sea." What came next was not orderly. Raymond moved quickly, the particular quickness of a man whose plan has collapsed and who is operating now entirely on instinct. He swung his legs over the side of the casket and stood, water still running from his hair, and turned to the room with his hands slightly raised in the gesture of a man attempting to establish calm. He said there had been a misunderstanding. He said what appeared to be the case was not the case. He said he could explain everything, that I was not well, that the grief of the preceding weeks had affected my perception, that what I had shared with the room was a version of events constructed from incomplete information and emotional distress. His voice was controlled. Even now, standing wet in his own casket at his own funeral, he was reaching for the register of a reasonable man being unfairly characterized. There were people in the room who looked at him. There were people who looked at me. There were people who looked at each other. Ruth had not moved from her seat. Her sisters were on either side of her. Her face had gone through several expressions in rapid succession. and had arrived at something I can only describe as the particular stillness of a person whose understanding of a situation has been so completely disrupted that the usual emotional responses have not yet found their footing. Raymond's eyes moved around the room and landed on Gerald. Something in his expression shifted. Ruth said in a voice very unlike her usual one, "Raymond. Just his name. Nothing else." He turned to her. For the first time since sitting up, something in his composure fractured. Not much. A tightening around the eyes. A momentary lapse in the careful positioning of his face. I said nothing further. I had said what I had come to say. I looked toward the side exit and nodded once. Gerald moved first, positioning himself near the main door. The two plainclothes officers moved simultaneously from opposite sides of the room. Not running, not dramatic, simply moving with the particular unhurried purpose of people executing a prepared plan. One of them showed Raymond his identification. He said Raymond's full name. He said he was being detained for questioning in connection with insurance fraud, conspiracy, and the falsification of official death documentation. The room, which had been very loud for about 4 minutes, became quiet again. Raymond looked at the officer. He looked at me. He opened his mouth once and then closed it. His lawyer, I was told later, arrived at the station 3 hours after he did. The legal process that followed took 16 months. It was, by the standards of these things, relatively clean, because the evidence was organized, thorough, and had been assembled with the specific intention of surviving legal scrutiny. Patricia Mensah had ensured that. Gerald's documentation had ensured that. My own months of careful, time-stamped record-keeping had ensured that. The financial forensics team traced every transfer from the joint account across its full timeline, establishing both the pattern and the intent. The falsified identification of the body was investigated separately and found to involve 3 individuals. The corrupt official Christine had cultivated, a former colleague of his who had processed the documentation, and Christine herself, whose professional access to insurance records had been central to the scheme's design. The recording Gerald had obtained, Raymond's voice, Christine's voice, the plan outlined in practical and specific terms, was admitted as evidence after a legal challenge from Raymond's defense that was ultimately unsuccessful. Raymond was convicted on 4 counts: insurance fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, financial deception within a marriage, and conspiracy to falsify official documentation. He was sentenced to 12 years. The judge, in delivering the sentence, made specific note of the planning duration and the level of deliberateness involved. Those words, planning duration, deliberateness, landed in the courtroom without drama and without requiring elaboration. Christine received 5 years with 2 suspended, and was required to repay her portion of the transferred assets. The funeral home employee who had facilitated Raymond's access to the casket the night before the service received a separate sentence for his role. Ruth was not implicated. The investigation found no evidence she had known anything. I believed that finding then, and I believe it now. The expression on her face when Raymond sat up in that casket was not the expression of a woman whose carefully maintained performance had cracked. It was the expression of a woman encountering a truth she had no framework for. Those are different things, and I have learned to tell them apart. I did not attend the sentencing. I had delivered my testimony months before, in a deposition that lasted 4 hours and which I prepared for with the same methodical attention I would bring to any complex project. I said what had happened in order with documentation to support each element. I did not editorialize. I did not become emotional. I answered questions directly and asked for clarification when questions were ambiguous. When it was over, I drove home. I made tea. I sat on my balcony for a while in the late afternoon light. That was, as far as I was concerned, the end of that part. I sold the house 6 months after the arrest. I could have kept it. It was mine, legally and practically, and the recovered assets from the civil judgment, a portion of what Raymond had transferred, clawed back through the financial fraud proceedings, meant I was not in a position of financial distress. But a house is also a structure, and that structure had been built on a foundation that no longer existed. I didn't need to live in the remnant of something. I found an apartment smaller, quieter, with good light and a west-facing balcony where I put a few plants that I actually keep alive. I went back to my work fully. Architecture, as it turns out, is a reliable companion in difficult periods. It demands your complete attention. It does not leave room for the kind of circular thinking that can otherwise fill the space that a long marriage leaves behind. With the recovered assets and a portion of my own savings, I established a small foundation. It is not publicly prominent, and I have no intention of making it so. Its focus is specific. Women who find themselves in positions of financial dependency within marriages that have become predatory. Women who do not know what they do not know about their own accounts, their own legal standing, their own documentation. We provide confidential consultations, legal referrals, and financial literacy resources. We have helped a number of women in the 2 years since I started it. I will not give a number here because their privacy matters more than any statistic I could offer. I did not speak to the press after the trial. I declined every interview request. I made no public statements. I want to ask you something broader. Where is the line between trust and negligence? I trusted Raymond with our finances not because I was careless, but because we had divided responsibility in a way that made practical sense and had never failed. At what point does reasonable trust become willful blindness? And how do you know, from the inside of a relationship, which one you are practicing? And finally, the question I think about most quietly, in the way you think about things that don't have answers but keep asking themselves anyway: how long do you hold on to a version of a person after they have shown you something different? How much of what Raymond was in those early years was real, and how much was prologue to this? I don't know. I'm not sure it's a question with a knowable answer. But I think it is worth asking. Leave your thoughts in the comments. I mean that as a genuine invitation, not a prompt. These are questions I am still working through, and I find that other people's perspectives, when offered honestly, are more useful than I expected. If this story reached you in some way, please share it. And if you want to stay for what comes next, subscribe. I have more stories. Some of them are quieter than this one. Some of them are not. Thank you for watching.